At dawn on January 1, 1943, the Pacific air was damp with salt and smoke. Inside a barbed wire enclosure on a stretch of American soil, far from the jungles of Guadalcanal or the burning atolls of Tarawa, Japanese prisoners of war stirred from their wooden bunks. The night had been quiet. Too quiet. The guards of the U.S. Army stockade stood watch with rifles slung, coats drawn tight against the winter wind. Beyond the wire, the world was still at war, but here in this compound, something was about to happen that would confound both victor and vanquished. The prisoners gathered hesitantly, some whispering, others silent, their faces carved with fatigue and suspicion. They had been taught that capture was dishonor worse than death. Many expected cruelty, degradation, starvation. Yet on this morning, instead of harsh orders or punishment, an American officer walked into the compound carrying something unexpected, a crate of rice, fish, and even sake. The guards, rather than forbidding movement, allowed the men to assemble in a courtyard. To the shock of the prisoners, the U.S. Army permitted them to celebrate New Year's Day, the most sacred holiday in Japanese tradition. U.S. Army POW Camp Log, Jan 1, 1943. For the Japanese soldiers, it was almost unthinkable. Back home, the New Year was a day of reverence, renewal, and ritual. Families gathered at shrines. Soldiers at the front lines prayed for survival. To them, it was the single day when discipline gave way to reflection. And here in captivity under their sworn enemy, the ritual was being respected. Some men wept quietly as rice balls were passed around. Others stood rigid, as though waiting for a trick. Could this be a trap, a test of loyalty, or was it impossibly mercy? The American guards watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. These were young men too, farm boys from Iowa, steel workers from Pittsburgh, clerks from Boston, who just months earlier had seen their countrymen slaughtered at Bataan, at Pearl Harbor, on Wake Island. Many had brothers still fighting across the Pacific, yet their orders today were clear: allow the prisoners to honor their tradition. Not as soldiers, but as men. War Department Memo, Office of the Provost Marshal General, 1943. The sounds inside the camp were unlike anything in wartime. Instead of gunfire or shouted commands, there was chanting, the soft beat of improvised drums and fragments of song. Prisoners bowed toward the rising sun, their voices carrying across the compound. For the Americans on duty, it was surreal, witnessing their enemy, once feared as fanatical fighters who would never surrender, now kneeling in quiet ceremony. A corporal scribbled in his diary, "It felt as though for one day the war had stopped at our fence." Private diary. Camp McCoy Guard, Jan 1943. The broader war, however, raged on with ferocity. The year 1943 stood at the turning point of the Pacific conflict. The United States had secured Guadalcanal in early February after months of savage combat. At the same time, Japanese forces were entrenching themselves across New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Central Pacific, determined to halt the Allied advance. Casualty lists climbed into the tens of thousands. The Imperial Japanese Navy, though battered, still controlled swaths of ocean. The war's outcome was far from decided. U.S. Army After Action Report, Feb 1943. Back home, America's war machine was shifting into overdrive. In 1942 alone, U.S. industry had produced more than 47,000 aircraft and 56,000 tanks, overwhelming Axis capacity. Detroit assembly lines now turned out Sherman tanks, while West Coast shipyards launched Liberty ships at record pace. Engineers and technicians, many of them immigrants or women new to the factories, worked day and night to meet quotas. This vast industrial surge allowed the U.S. military not only to fight across oceans, but also to maintain camps for thousands of prisoners, camps where even small concessions, like allowing a New Year's celebration, were logistically possible. War Production Board Report 1943. For the Japanese soldiers now prisoners in these camps, the contrast was staggering. They had been raised in a military culture where captivity equaled shame, where surrender was a stain upon family honor, where even admitting hunger could be seen as weakness. Now they were confronted with an enemy that treated them not with the cruelty they expected, but with a measured bureaucratic orderliness, and occasionally, as on this day, with startling humanity. Some prisoners later recalled that this single event, this strange New Year's morning, began to erode the myths they had been told about Americans being barbarians. Post-war interrogation transcript, U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division, 1946, but not all were convinced. Within the wire, factions existed. Hardcore loyalists whispered that the celebration was a trick, a way to soften them for propaganda. Others saw it as humiliation, a reminder that they were celebrating not in Tokyo but behind fences. One prisoner reportedly muttered, "We bow to the sun, but the sun does not shine here," dramatized composite. Yet the Americans insisted on letting the day unfold. Guards patrolled with rifles at rest, intervening only to keep order. Officers watched with caution, but no malice. The event passed without incident. No escape attempts, no violence. By evening, the prisoners had sung, eaten, and performed rituals for the new year, and the camp returned to silence. But the moment lingered. This decision by the U.S. military did not arise from sentiment alone. It was part of a deliberate policy rooted in the Geneva Conventions of 1929, which the United States had signed and sought to uphold, even against an adversary who had not ratified them. American commanders believed that humane treatment of prisoners could have strategic value. It reinforced moral high ground, provided intelligence opportunities, and undercut enemy propaganda that painted Americans as ruthless. Judge Advocate General's Office, POW Directive 1942. In the broader tapestry of the war, this single morning might seem small. No bombs fell. No ships sank. No territory changed hands. Yet its meaning was profound. On a day when the world still reeled from destruction, two enemies found themselves bound by an unexpected moment of respect. For the prisoners, it was a crack in the iron wall of hatred they had been taught. For the guards, it was a reminder that even in total war, the human spirit could briefly transcend orders and battle lines. And yet, this act of mercy also carried risk. Critics within the ranks wondered, was this softness dangerous? Could allowing the enemy to celebrate embolden them, or make them harder to control? Some argued that discipline might fray if kindness became routine. Others believed it was the very proof of American strength, that even at war they could afford compassion. The debate lingered in the barracks long after the rice bowls were cleared. U.S. Army Morale Report 1943. As the winter night fell, the prisoners lay awake, many staring at the ceiling, turning over the strangeness of the day. In the darkness, their thoughts drifted to families in Japan, to distant shrines, to the war raging across seas. For the Americans, guard towers loomed against the stars, their searchlights sweeping the wire. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, reminder that outside the camp the machinery of war was still moving, unstoppable. But inside the fences, something had shifted. A silence deeper than routine patrols or curfews had settled. The memory of the celebration, fragile and fleeting, would endure among both captors and captives. And in time, it would reveal something larger about how America wielded not only steel and firepower, but also the quiet weapon of psychological influence. Because in war, even small mercies carry weight. And what began as a single New Year's gesture would soon unfold into a hidden advantage the Japanese could not have anticipated. What the Japanese prisoners could not yet grasp was that their captors' decision to permit celebration was not simply a gesture of mercy. It reflected a deeper, hidden advantage, an American approach to warfare that fused industrial might, psychological strategy, and an almost bureaucratic devotion to rules. To the men behind the wire, the celebration hinted at something strange. The enemy was not driven solely by vengeance, but by systems, policies, and resources on a scale that defied imagination. To understand the contrast, one must return to the doctrine of Imperial Japan. Its soldiers were trained to view surrender as a stain worse than death. Their code, rooted in Bushido, demanded sacrifice at any cost. When captured, they expected brutality, starvation, or execution. The idea that an enemy would treat them according to an international convention seemed absurd. And yet America had designed entire facilities, stockades, barracks, kitchens, medical units, to house prisoners not as beasts, but as regulated wards of war. Office of the Provost Marshal General, POW Directive 1942. This was possible only because of America's colossal logistics network. By 1943, the United States operated over 500 POW camps on the mainland, housing more than 425,000 Axis prisoners, most of them Germans and Italians, but increasingly Japanese as the Pacific campaigns intensified. Each camp required food shipments, medical supplies, clothing, and armed guards. Trains delivered rations from Midwest farms. Trucks distributed uniforms manufactured by textile mills. Even the wooden barracks themselves were products of standardized War Department blueprints, assembled by engineers and contractors. War Department Construction Manual, 1942. Japan, by contrast, lacked the infrastructure to replicate such an undertaking. Its prisoner camps, when they existed, were notorious for deprivation. Scarcity of food, medicine, and industrial resources left captives in dire conditions. In Tokyo's calculus, prisoners were an afterthought. For Washington, they became a strategic tool. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The technical machinery of this system was astonishing. Each prisoner was issued identification tags, clothing stamped with PW, and medical records filed in duplicate. Camps were outfitted with kitchens capable of serving thousands of meals a day, powered by steel stoves manufactured in Pennsylvania. Water towers designed by U.S. Army Corps engineers ensured sanitation. Even rice, an unfamiliar staple for most American diets, was procured through supply chains that reached West Coast ports and rail distribution hubs. Quartermaster Corps Supply Report, 1943. For the Japanese, accustomed to the razor-thin margins of an island nation at war, the abundance was shocking. A bowl of rice at New Year's was not just food. It was proof of America's industrial depth. To the guards, these provisions were ordinary logistics. To the prisoners, they were revelations. But the true weight of this advantage revealed itself not inside barbed wire, but on the battlefield. Consider the clash on Guadalcanal just months earlier. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines stormed the island, clashing with Japanese defenders who had fortified its jungles and airfield. For 6 months, the campaign raged. The Japanese, supplied by what came to be called the Tokyo Express, relied on destroyers and barges to ferry troops and supplies under cover of night. Their logistical lines were thin, fragile, and easily severed. American forces, by contrast, drew upon a vast convoy system supported by Liberty ships, cargo planes, and mobile field depots. When Marines needed ammunition or rations, supply crates arrived by sea in staggering quantities. U.S. Navy Logistics Report, Guadalcanal, 1942. One Japanese survivor later recalled watching in disbelief as Americans hauled crates of canned meat, rifles, and even cigarettes ashore in the midst of battle. To him, it seemed impossible. His unit by then was rationed to handfuls of rice and roots scavenged from the jungle. Disease spread unchecked, malaria and dysentery killing more men than bullets. By January 1943, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were starving, reduced to 1/3 rations. The Americans, though battered, still fought with full bellies and steady streams of ammunition. Post-war interrogation, Japanese officer, 1946. The difference was not courage, it was logistics. America's industrial base, coordinated through what General George C. Marshall called the arsenal of democracy, ensured that its soldiers never went without. Engineers designed prefabricated docks known as Seabees piers that could be assembled in days. Refrigerated cargo ships preserved meat across the Pacific. Oil tankers fueled destroyers and carriers thousands of miles from home. The system was relentless, efficient, and overwhelming. Bureau of Ships Report, 1943. Guadalcanal became the test case of this hidden advantage. On January 31, 1943, after months of attrition, the Japanese High Command ordered evacuation. Over 10,000 survivors were spirited away by destroyer, their campaign in tatters. In total, Japan lost more than 25,000 men on Guadalcanal. The Americans lost roughly 7,000, a heavy toll but one they could replace. U.S. Army After Action Report, 1943. Inside Japanese POW camps back in America, news of Guadalcanal filtered slowly. But whispers spread. The Imperial Army had been forced to retreat. To prisoners, this was unthinkable. Hadn't their leaders promised invincibility? Now behind the wire, their celebration of New Year's was tinged with a new awareness. Their captors, who seemed almost casual in their generosity, belonged to a war machine that did not falter. The technical depth of that machine deserves pause. Radios crackled with constant communication, thanks to engineers at companies like Motorola, who designed compact FM sets that coordinated infantry and armor with unmatched precision. Factories in Detroit and Buffalo churned out trucks by the tens of thousands, GMCs and Dodges that carried supplies from ports to depots to front lines. Standardized crates and pallets, innovations credited to logistics officers like Colonel Norman Nye, allowed forklifts and cranes to move goods with unprecedented speed. Even the cigarettes given to POWs at times were products of calculated supply chains, shipped in bulk for troop morale. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943. The Japanese prisoners, many of them educated men, officers, engineers, even a few doctors, sensed the difference. One later remarked during interrogation, "We fought with swords against factories." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. But the most devastating realization was psychological. If America could afford to give prisoners food and time to celebrate a holiday, what did that say about its capacity to fight? For men raised on the notion of total sacrifice, it was baffling. They could not comprehend how a nation so lenient with enemies could be so ruthless on the battlefield. The contradiction haunted them. In the barracks, some spoke of America's heartlessness in firebombing cities, while others pointed to the rice bowls as proof of strange decency. Guards overheard arguments in hushed tones, debates over whether Japan could ever match such power. The camp became not only a holding pen, but a crucible of doubt. On the front lines, that doubt spread too. Reports from Guadalcanal and later Tarawa and Kwajalein told of overwhelming American logistics. Japanese commanders wrote of fighting an enemy who seemed to conjure endless supplies from the sea. One diary entry recovered from a fallen officer read simply, "They do not run out." Bundesarchiv, captured Japanese diary 1943. In this hidden advantage lay the seeds of strategic collapse. Japan's warriors, indoctrinated to fight to the last breath, found themselves starving, undersupplied and abandoned. Meanwhile, their comrades who became prisoners witnessed an enemy so confident in victory that it could extend mercy without fear. And that was the true power of the New Year's celebration. It was not merely rice and ritual. It was a demonstration of strength cloaked in kindness. A signal, however subtle, that America's war machine was vast enough to accommodate both destruction and dignity. But the impact would not remain confined to single battles or isolated camps. The weight of this hidden advantage, logistics, industry, and psychological leverage, would ripple across the Pacific, shaping not only campaigns, but the very morale of two nations locked in total war. The question now was simple yet profound. What effect would this duality of mercy and might have on the future of the conflict, and on the men whose lives hung in its balance? By the spring of 1943, the war in the Pacific was a furnace consuming men, ships, and entire cities. Yet far from the front lines, inside the quiet fences of American POW camps, the memory of that New Year's celebration lingered. For Japanese prisoners, it was a riddle. For their American guards, it was routine. But together, these moments of mercy began to accumulate into something larger, an invisible pressure shaping the psychology of war itself. The strategic effect of humane treatment was subtle at first. Japanese soldiers taken captive often entered camp defiant, expecting starvation or execution. Instead, they found order, beds, food, medical treatment, even occasional allowances for tradition. Some refused the generosity, viewing it as dishonor, but others over time began to talk. To interrogators, to chaplains, to guards who simply stood watch. From these conversations, the U.S. military harvested invaluable intelligence on supply routes, unit morale, even the growing shortages plaguing the Japanese home islands. Military Intelligence Service, POW Interrogation Report 1943. This was the paradox. Kindness became a weapon. By demonstrating abundance, America sowed doubt. By allowing rituals, it eroded certainty. A soldier who expected torment but received rice might wonder what else his commanders had lied about. A man who watched his captors' convoys rumble by, delivering endless supplies, might question whether Japan could ever win. These seeds of doubt, planted quietly in POW camps, spread into the broader psyche of the Imperial Army. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Morale Division, 1946. Meanwhile, in the Pacific campaigns, the hidden advantage of logistics grew into a juggernaut. At Tarawa in November 1943, American Marines stormed the beaches of a coral atoll, fortified by 4,500 Japanese defenders. The battle was savage, with over 1,000 Marines killed in 3 days. Yet once the island was secured, US Seabees constructed airfields in record time, turning the atoll into a launching pad for further assaults. The Japanese, cut off and undersupplied, could not match the pace. A captured officer later admitted in interrogation, "We did not fear your men as much as your machines. Your food, your ships without end." Post-war interrogation transcript. U.S. Army, 1946. For America, the logistics network was more than crates and convoys. It was morale itself. Soldiers fought with confidence, knowing supplies would reach them. Cigarettes, canned peaches, clean socks, all small comforts that reinforced belief in the system. Japanese troops, by contrast, withered under shortages. Letters home begged for food. Diaries spoke of hunger and despair. When these same men became prisoners and found bowls of rice waiting for them, the psychological gulf widened into a chasm. This gulf echoed back to Japan in unexpected ways. After 1943, news trickled through underground channels that captured soldiers were not being executed, but fed. Some families received word from the Red Cross that their sons were alive in camps overseas. This contradicted the propaganda that painted America as savage. It also clashed with the Japanese government's insistence that capture was equivalent to death. To admit a son lived as a prisoner was taboo, yet whispers circulated. The enemy treated captives better than Japan treated its own. International Red Cross Records, 1944. For American leadership, this was deliberate. General Marshall and his staff understood that war was not only fought with bullets, but with perceptions. By upholding the Geneva Conventions, they bolstered America's image abroad and reinforced alliances. By extending humane treatment, they weakened enemy propaganda. It was not sentimentality, it was strategy. War Department Psychological Warfare Division, 1943. The cost was not negligible. Feeding prisoners required tonnage that might otherwise go to the front. Guarding them tied down manpower. Yet the return on investment was immense. Intelligence, moral authority, and the psychological destabilization of an enemy. As one U.S. officer wrote, "A man who eats from your table may someday speak from your hand." Army Intelligence Memo, 1943. The psychological toll on Japanese prisoners grew over time. Some adapted, studying English, working in camp labor programs, even participating in cultural exchanges with local towns. Others remained bitter, refusing to eat or speak. But the memory of small mercies, New Year's rice, medical care, letters delivered home, ate at their certainty. One prisoner scrawled in a hidden notebook, "If they are monsters, why do they feed us?" Recovered POW Journal, 1945. The duality of war, brutality abroad, mercy at home, haunted both sides. American bombers incinerated Japanese cities, while American guards shared cigarettes with Japanese captives. The contradiction was not hypocrisy but policy. Annihilation where necessary, humanity where useful. In this blend lay the genius and cold efficiency of total war. By 1944 and 1945, as the U.S. island-hopping campaign drew closer to Japan, the contrast grew unbearable. Japanese soldiers on Saipan and Iwo Jima, indoctrinated to expect death, fought to the last man, often committing suicide rather than surrender. Yet survivors who did fall captive once again found themselves treated within systems that, while strict, were humane compared to their nightmares. For some, this shattered their faith. For others, it left them broken in ways deeper than wounds. U.S. Marine Corps Psychological Assessment, 1945. After the war, the legacy of these choices became clear. Post-war surveys of former Japanese prisoners revealed that many had been more shocked by humane treatment than by defeat itself. It undermined decades of military indoctrination and left them questioning their own nation's leadership. Some even spoke of admiration for America's industrial system, its ability to combine force with restraint. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The engineers, technicians, and planners who sustained this hidden advantage rarely appeared in headlines. Yet without the War Production Board, the Quartermaster Corps, the Seabees, and countless factory workers, men and women alike, there would have been no rice bowls, no barracks, no orderly camps. The celebration of New Year's in a Wisconsin stockade or a Texas camp was made possible not by chance, but by assembly lines in Detroit, by railroads in Kansas, by engineers designing efficient stoves and water towers. Every act of mercy was underwritten by blueprints, sweat, and steel. War Production Board Final Report, 1945. The Cold War carried these lessons forward. America recognized that humane treatment of prisoners was not just moral, it was tactical. From Korea to Vietnam to Iraq, the idea of using care as leverage echoed. Not always perfectly, not always sincerely, but rooted in the same wartime discovery. Mercy could break an enemy's will as surely as firepower. For Japan, the legacy was more complex. Post-war reconstruction erased some of the shame of captivity, but the memory lingered among veterans. Many who had been prisoners later spoke of confusion, how the same enemy that bombed their homeland had allowed them to celebrate sacred traditions. For some, it planted the first seeds of reconciliation. In the end, the story of Japanese POWs celebrating New Year's in American camps was not about rice or ritual alone. It was about the strange duality of war, the clash between steel and compassion, annihilation and dignity. It was about how a superpower, confident in its factories and fleets, could extend gestures that seemed unthinkable to an enemy raised on sacrifice. And it was about how those gestures, though small, left cracks in the armor of fanaticism. As one former prisoner wrote decades later, "On that day, I realized our empire was not only outnumbered, but outsupplied, outfed, and outthought. They were so powerful they could afford to be kind." Dramatized composite. In modern war, this lesson endures. Firepower wins battles, but perception shapes wars. Mercy, when wielded with calculation, becomes as sharp as a sword. The New Year's rice bowls of 1943 were more than food. They were a quiet demonstration of supremacy, and a reminder that in the crucible of total war, humanity itself can become a weapon.